Alright team, let's start talking about some blood. So, if you've looked at the cardiovascular system before this video, this shouldn't be any big shock. But blood is the liquid that we have inside these tubes in our body called blood vessels. So the idea is blood circulates around carrying nutrients, proteins, hormones, and other cells. Basically whatever really needs to move around the body to get from one place to another. If you remember way back in week 3 when we defined the different types of tissues, blood came up as a type of connective tissue, but it was unique in that the thing that all the cells were floating in was a liquid, not a solid like other tissues. Blood is 65% liquid, or plasma. And most of the plasma is just water, with about 7% being large proteins like albumin, which makes sure that the blood doesn't leak out everywhere, it keeps it in our vessels. And the other 2% being things like electrolytes, or free oxygen molecules that are dissolved in the liquid. So that leaves the other 45% as cells, and that's what we're going to spend most of our discussion on here today. We'll circle back to the plasma piece when we talk about the electrolytes, acid-base balance, and fluids. So of that 45% of cells, we can divide them into 3 categories: platelets, leukocytes, and erythrocytes. Together we will call these the formed elements of blood. All of these formed elements start from stem cells, which are unspecialized cells that can be found in red bone marrow. The stem cell grows up into one of the different types of cells, and when it dies, it can be recycled by the lymphatic system and the spleen to help make new blood cells. So if you ever get blood work drawn, often what they'll do, depending on why you're getting blood work drawn at all, is they'll put your blood into a centrifuge, which is this big machine that spins the tube around, and it separates the plasma and the formed elements. So the plasma sits on top, and your formed elements are on the bottom. Now this allows us to have a look and see exactly what's going on in your cells, how many of each type of cell you have, and then we can look in the plasma and see how much of the fluid is there and what makes it up. So let's talk about the formed elements. Let's start off with our platelets, or thrombocytes. Platelets are these tiny cells that float around all over the body, and their job is to stick together whenever another cell gets injured. So let's say we hurt our leg and we have a small cut there, it's bleeding a little bit. The damaged epithelial tissues in the vessels will be rougher than normal. There won't be that smooth lining. And that's going to start to aggravate or rough up the platelets. And when they get roughed up or aggravated, they start to stick together. Think back to the endocardium and the tunica intima. That's why these layers have to be really, really smooth. So the platelets get sticky and they latched on to the damaged tissues. And then as they latch on, they start grabbing more platelets, and soon they build up to this big mass of platelets that hopefully is big enough to stop the bleeding. Besides all those platelets bunching up and basically clogging up the hole, the damaged tissue will release a bunch of clotting factors that will eventually form what's called prothrombin activator. So the platelets will also try and make prothrombin activator, so there's two mechanisms going on here. Prothrombin activator is an enzyme that activates prothrombin. And prothrombin is a chemical that's just floating around in the blood. It's part of that 7% of plasma. When that gets activated, it gets turned into thrombin, which is another enzyme that will turn another protein called fibrinogen into these really fine web strands called fibrin. And that's what makes up blood clots. That was really confusing. So let's go right from the top. You get cut. Your platelets get sticky, and we work to stop the bleeding. So platelets are sticking together, and they're trying to plug the hole. Clotting factors get released, and they make prothrombin activator. The prothrombin activator is an enzyme that turns prothrombin into thrombin. And then thrombin is another enzyme that turns fibrinogen into fibrin. So there's like 2 enzymes kind of going on here. Then fibrin gets really sticky and makes these webs all over the place, kind of all around that big ball of platelets, and then that forms the blood clot. This is actually the really simplified version of the clotting cascade. There's loads of other steps involved, lots of other vitamins and chemicals and enzymes, and they work to make sure the clot gets formed quickly and then dissolve when it needs to dissolve, but also make sure that we don't form clots when we're not supposed to. Doing that is what causes things like heart attacks and stroke. So the next type of cell found in the blood are called leukocytes. And these are commonly called white blood cells. Leukocytes are different than the other cells in blood in that these guys all have a nucleus, and then some of them have organelles inside of them. The organelles show up as these little grains when you look at them under a microscope, so oftentimes leukocytes are broken up into granulocytes and agranulocytes. as in no granules, depending on if they have organelles. All leukocytes have the same function, and that's to destroy foreign things in the body. They play a big role in our body's immune system, so I'm going to save a lot of the intricacies on those for the videos on that. There are 5 types of leukocytes: neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, lymphocytes, and monocytes. Neutrophils are the most common, and they usually act as our first defense against a new infection, whereas cells like eosinophils and basophils are less common, and they're more important in our longer-term immunity. They also play a big role in allergic reactions, which is just an immune response that attacks your own body. Lymphocytes are part of the body's more specific immune response, and monocytes are the largest leukocyte, and they handle the bigger issues like bacteria and fungus and fully infected cells. In this video, we're just going to talk about the general names, but I'll dive into more detail in my videos on the lymphatic system. Lastly, we have erythrocytes, or red blood cells, and these are the most numerous parts of blood. Because there are so many of them, it gives blood that distinct red color. So the red blood cell's job is to carry oxygen from the lungs, drop it off to the tissue, wherever that tissue is in the body, pick up the waste that's left over from the cell, and bring it back to the lungs. Fun fact, red blood cells turn red when they bind to oxygen and turn more of a blue color when there's no oxygen in them, when they have CO2. That's why the blood in your arteries is red, whereas the blood in your veins is more of that dark blue color. So erythrocytes have developed 2 structures that make them really good at grabbing hold of oxygen and carrying it where it needs to go. One is their shape. Red blood cells are shaped like a concave disc, and this increases their surface area, which allows more space for the oxygen and CO2 to stick on. The other special property is this structure inside the red blood cell called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is made up of iron-containing molecules called heme, and that iron reacts to the oxygen, which allows the oxygen to stick to the blood cell and then easily be carried away.